Meditation has been practiced for thousands of years across dozens of cultures. For most of that time, the claims made about its benefits were experiential. Practitioners reported feeling calmer, more focused, more emotionally stable. The mechanisms were invisible and the evidence was anecdotal. In the last 20 years, neuroimaging technology has made the invisible visible. MRI scanners can measure the volume of specific brain structures. Functional MRI can measure activity in specific brain regions in real time. And the findings that have accumulated from applying these tools to meditators, from 8-week beginners to decades-long practitioners, have produced a picture that is more specific, more structural, and more surprising than the anecdotal tradition suggested. Meditation does not just change how you feel, it changes the physical structure of the brain, measurably, in ways that are detectable on an MRI scan, in ways that correlate with the specific cognitive and emotional changes that practitioners report. This is the story of what those structural changes are, which brain regions are involved, and why the default mode network, the brain system most associated with the kind of chronic mental suffering that meditation has always claimed to address, is the centerpiece of the neurological explanation for why meditation works. The amygdala is the brain structure most associated with fear, threat detection, and the emotional alarm response. It is the region that activates when a threat is perceived, real or imagined, and it triggers the cascade of physiological responses that constitute the stress response. Elevated cortisol, elevated heart rate, heightened alertness, narrowed attention. The amygdala does not distinguish well between physical threats and psychological ones. Social rejection, anticipated failure, and rumination about past events activate the amygdala through the same pathways as genuinely dangerous situations. In people with chronic stress and anxiety, the amygdala is chronically active. It maintains a low-level threat detection mode that keeps the stress response partially engaged even in the absence of acute threat. The amygdala of a chronically anxious person is, in measurable neuroimaging terms, more reactive and more persistently active than the amygdala of a person without chronic anxiety. Britta Hölzel and Sarah Lazar at Harvard Medical School conducted a landmark study in 2011 that directly measured the effect of an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program on amygdala volume and reactivity. Participants with no prior meditation experience completed the 8-week program, while a control group did not. MRI scans before and after showed that the meditation group showed measurably reduced gray matter density in the right amygdala, a structural change in the brain corresponding to reduced emotional reactivity, while the control group showed no such change. Reduced gray matter density in the amygdala corresponds to reduced amygdala reactivity, less hair-trigger threat detection, less reflexive emotional activation, less tendency toward the anxiety and rumination that chronic amygdala overactivity produces. 8 weeks, no prior experience, a structural change in the brain that is detectable on an MRI scan. This finding has been replicated across multiple independent research groups using different meditation protocols, different populations, and different imaging methodologies. The direction and the location of the change, reduced amygdala volume and reactivity following sustained meditation practice, are consistent. Sarah Lazar's earlier research, published in NeuroReport in 2005, established a complementary finding on the other side of the cortical-amygdala relationship. Lazar compared the brain structure of experienced meditators, people who had been practicing for an average of 9 years, to age-matched non-meditators. The experienced meditators showed significantly greater cortical thickness in several brain regions, including the insula, the sensory cortices, and most notably the prefrontal cortex, specifically the regions associated with attention, interoception, and executive function. Cortical thickness declines with normal aging. The cortex thins as neurons and their connections are lost over time. The experienced meditators in Lazar's study showed cortical thickness in these regions that was comparable to people significantly younger. The age-related thinning appeared to have been slowed or reversed in the regions most associated with the cognitive processes that meditation specifically trains. The prefrontal cortex is the brain region responsible for executive function, the deliberate, effortful regulation of attention, emotion, and behavior. It is the primary inhibitory control over the amygdala. When the prefrontal cortex is engaged, it can reduce the amygdala's threat response. The relationship between a thicker, more robust prefrontal cortex and a less reactive amygdala is bidirectional and mutually reinforcing. A stronger prefrontal cortex produces better emotional regulation, and better emotional regulation reduces the chronic amygdala activation that impairs prefrontal function. Meditation trains both simultaneously. It trains the prefrontal cortex through the sustained attention practice that is the foundation of most meditation techniques. And it reduces amygdala reactivity through the emotional regulation effects that this prefrontal strengthening produces. The default mode network is the brain system that the neuroscience of meditation has most significantly illuminated, and it is the finding that most directly explains the subjective experience of meditation practice and the suffering it is designed to address. The default mode network, DMN, is a set of interconnected brain regions including the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus that become active when the brain is not engaged in a specific external task. When you are not focused on something specific, when your mind wanders, the DMN is active. The DMN was initially described as the brain's resting state network, the activity pattern that emerges in the absence of directed cognitive engagement. But subsequent research has established that the DMN is not simply idle activity. It is the neural substrate of self-referential thought, thinking about yourself, your past, your future, your relationships, your problems. It is the network that generates the mental time travel of rumination and anticipatory worry. Research on mind wandering, the default mental activity produced by DMN activation, has found that people spend approximately 47% of their waking hours with their minds wandering from the present moment. And a large-scale study by Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert found that mind wandering is associated with reduced happiness regardless of what the person is doing. People are less happy when their minds are wandering, even when they are wandering toward pleasant thoughts, than when they are focused on what they are doing. The DMN in chronic states of activation, which characterizes depression, anxiety, and the ruminative thinking patterns associated with both, is a neural architecture of suffering. Not acute suffering from external events, but the sustained background suffering generated by a mind that cannot settle into the present moment. Meditation, specifically mindfulness meditation, which involves sustaining attention in the present moment and returning to it when the mind wanders, is, at the neural level, the practice of reducing default mode network activity and strengthening the attentional networks that compete with it. Studies of experienced meditators using functional MRI consistently find reduced activity in the default mode network's core regions, the posterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, both during meditation and in the resting state between meditation sessions. The experienced meditator's brains default to less self-referential, less ruminative activity patterns than non-meditating controls. This is not a temporary change that exists only during meditation practice. It is a trait change, a persistent alteration in the baseline activity patterns of the brain that reflects the effects of sustained practice on the underlying neural architecture. The hippocampus, which we have encountered in the context of blueberries, exercise, and sleep, also shows structural changes with meditation practice. The hippocampus is involved in emotional regulation as well as memory formation. It plays a role in contextualizing threatening stimuli, providing the memory-based information that allows the brain to recognize when a situation that resembles a past threat is actually safe. A well-functioning hippocampus is part of the neural infrastructure that allows appropriate fear responses rather than generalized anxiety. Chronic stress, through the cortisol exposure that sustained amygdala activation produces, damages the hippocampus. Hippocampal neurons are particularly sensitive to cortisol, and chronic elevation of cortisol is associated with hippocampal volume loss, reduced neurogenesis, and impaired memory function. Meditation, by reducing chronic amygdala reactivity and thereby reducing chronic cortisol elevation, removes one of the primary drivers of hippocampal damage. Studies of meditators have found greater hippocampal gray matter volume compared to matched non-meditators, a finding consistent with the neuroprotective effect of reduced chronic stress. The practical question is, what duration and form of practice produce the documented structural changes? The 8-week finding from the Hölzel and Lazar amygdala research used a standard mindfulness-based stress reduction protocol, approximately 2.5 hours of formal practice per week, plus a full-day retreat at the end of the program. This is the minimum duration at which structural brain changes have been detected in well-controlled studies. The cortical thickening findings from experienced meditators, people with 9 or more years of practice, represent the longer-term trajectory. The 8-week studies show the beginning of structural change. The experienced meditator studies show where sustained practice leads. The form of meditation matters less than the consistency and the sustained attention component. Studies have found structural changes from body scan practices, from breath-focused attention, from loving-kindness meditation, and from open monitoring practices. The common element is sustained attention, the practice of noticing where the mind has gone and returning it to the chosen object of attention. This is the mental action that trains the prefrontal attentional networks and reduces DMN dominance over time. Daily practice produces more consistent structural changes than equivalent total time distributed across occasional longer sessions. The regularity of the training stimulus appears to matter for neural adaptation in the same way that it does for physical training. 20 minutes per day consistently produces more robust changes than 2 hours per week inconsistently. Here is the synthesis. Meditation produces structural changes in the brain that are detectable on MRI scans. The amygdala, the emotional alarm system, shows reduced gray matter density and reduced reactivity after 8 weeks of mindfulness practice. The prefrontal cortex, the executive control system that regulates attention and inhibits emotional reactivity, shows greater cortical thickness in experienced meditators, with the age-related cortical thinning appearing slowed or reversed in the regions meditation specifically trains. The default mode network, the neural substrate of self-referential thought, rumination, and the mind-wandering that research associates with unhappiness, shows reduced baseline activity in experienced meditators. This is a trait change, a persistent alteration in the brain's default activity pattern rather than a state change present only during meditation sessions. The hippocampus is protected from the cortisol-mediated damage that chronic amygdala overactivity produces. 8 weeks of regular practice produces detectable structural changes. Years of practice produces changes visible in comparison with age-matched non-meditators. The form of practice matters less than the sustained attention component and the consistency of daily practice. The claims that meditation traditions have made for thousands of years about reduced suffering, improved emotional stability, and greater cognitive clarity now have a neurological architecture. The brain changes are real. The MRI data shows what the practitioners always described. The mechanism is the structure. If this changed how you think about meditation as a serious neurological intervention rather than a wellness trend, hit the like button.